Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tuning into something really fundamental about music. It goes way beyond just the notes you see written down.
Yeah, it's about how we actually, divide up the octave.
Exactly. It's this subtle realm, but it really shapes the whole sonic landscape.
Yeah,
One of our sources had this great line calling tuning the subtle magic that shapes the very fabric of musical reality.
that's a perfect description. And that's really what we're digging into today.
Right.
Our mission, if you like, is to unpack these different ways music's been tuned throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
We want to get a handle on what these systems are, sure, but also how they've affected the music we make and maybe even how we actually hear sound.
Yeah, that's the fascinating part. So we've looked into basically three main approaches people have taken.
Right, Pythagorean tuning, mean tone temperament.
And the one we mostly use now, equal temperament.
And what's really interesting is how each one prioritizes different things, like what sounds right or in tune.
Totally different priorities. So, okay, where should we start this journey? It feels like a deep rabbit hole.
Let's start at the beginning, or, well, the earliest system we have good info on.
Right.
That's Pythagorean tuning.
Back to ancient Greece, right?
Exactly. And for them, music wasn't just, tunes. It was tied into the cosmos, into mathematics.
Order and harmony.
Yeah, they believed these simple ratios, like 2.1 for the octave or 3.2 for a perfect fifth. They weren't just musical. They were like universal laws.
Wow. Music as a reflection of the universe itself. And they built their scales using that perfect fifth, the 3.2 ratio.
That's the core idea. You start on a note, find the note a perfect fifth above it, then find the fifth above that one, and so on, stacking fifths.
Like building with sonic Legos
Mhm.
based on that one ratio, and eventually you get all 12 notes.
Kind of, yeah. It generates the notes we use. And the big advantage, the reason it lasted so long, was how pure those key intervals sounded.
The octaves and the fifths.
Absolutely pure. 2.1 and 3.2. And in early polyphony, music with multiple voices, those intervals were crucial. That clarity was really valued.
Okay, but there's a catch, isn't there? I remember reading about this. That circle of fifths, it doesn't quite connect back perfectly.
Bingo. You hit the fundamental problem. When you stack 12 pure fifths, you overshoot the starting note by several octaves, obviously, by a tiny bit.
And that tiny bit has a name, right? The Pythagorean comma.
That's it. It's small, maybe about a quarter of a semitone, something like 23.5 cents if you measure it that way.
Doesn't sound like much, but it has consequences.
Oh, definitely. The biggest one is the major third, because you're building everything from pure fifths. The result, major third ends up, well, mathematically, it's 81.64.
Which is not the simple 5.4 ratio we often think of as a pure third.
Not even close, relatively speaking. It sounds noticeably sharper, maybe even a bit harsh to our ears today, which are more used to other compromises.
So chords using that Pythagorean third might sound a bit tense
No.
or just off.
They could, yeah, especially as harmony got more complex.
Yeah.
This system worked brilliantly for music that stayed close to its starting key, few sharps or flats.
But if you tried to wander too far harmonically,
You'd run into those really sharp thirds, and other intervals would start sounding pretty rough too. It definitely limited the harmonic possibilities. But it's important to say it was the system for ages, and you can still hear its influence.
okay, so people eventually wanted something different, particularly with those thirds. That brings us to mean tone temperament.
Exactly. This really took off during the Renaissance. Composers were writing music with richer chords, more thirds and sixths, and those sharp Pythagorean thirds just weren't cutting it aesthetically.
So mean tone was about finding a middle ground, making the thirds sound better.
Precisely. It was a deliberate compromise. The goal was to get those major thirds closer to that pure 5.4 ratio, which sounds really smooth and consonant.
And how did they do that? What was the trade-off?
The trade-off was the perfect fifth. In mean tone, you intentionally flatten the fifth slightly, compared to the pure 3.2 ratio.
Ah, so you sacrificed the perfect purity of the fifth to gain sweeter thirds.
That's the essence of it. The most common version was quarter comma mean tone.
quarter comma.
Yeah, it refers to how much you flatten the fifths. Basically, you make 4 fifths slightly smaller, each by a quarter of another type of comma, the syntonic comma, which is about 21.5 cents.
Okay, that's technical, but the result was.
The result was major thirds that were almost perfectly pure, very close to 5.4. Really smooth, really consonant. It gave the music of that era, Renaissance and early Baroque, a very characteristic sound.
You can imagine that sounding lovely on, like, organs or harpsichords.
Absolutely. Those instruments were often tuned in mean tone. It created this rich, resonant quality In the keys, they didn't have too many sharps or flats.
But there's always a but, isn't there? What was the downside here?
The downside was what happened when you did venture into keys with more sharps or flats, because you'd flatten most of the fifths.
One of them must end up really, really out of tune to make the circle work.
Exactly. You ended up with one hideously dissonant fifth, way flatter than the others. It was so bad they called it the wolf fifth.
A wolf fifth. Sounds nasty.
It howls, apparently. Basically, it made modulating freely to distant keys impossible. Certain keys were just unusable because the wolf interval would show up.
So, great for some keys, terrible for others. It locked music into a certain harmonic range.
Pretty much. It shaped the sound and possibilities of music for a couple of centuries, but eventually composers wanted more freedom.
Which leads us, finally, to the system most of us live with today. Equal temperament.
The current standard, yeah. At least in most Western music.
And the big idea here is equality.
Total equality. You take the octave and you divide it into 12 mathematically identical semitones.
Every half step is exactly the same size.
Precisely. The frequency ratio between any two adjacent notes is the 12th root of 2. It's neat, mathematically.
And this system didn't just appear overnight, right? It took a while to catch on.
No, it was a gradual process, really picking up steam in the 18th and 19th centuries. Music was getting more complex. Composers wanted to explore all the keys, modulate anywhere.
And equal temperament lets you do that.
That's its superpower. Because every key is structured identically, you can move from one to another seamlessly. Nothing sounds drastically more out of tune than anything else.
It also made building instruments easier, I assume.
Hugely easier.
Yeah.
Pianos, guitars, wind instruments. They can all be built to this standard and play reasonably well in tune in any key.
But wait, if Pythagorean had pure fifths and mean tone had pure thirds, what did equal temperament sacrifice?
It sounds too good to be true.
Ah, the compromise. In equal temperament, every interval except the octaves is technically slightly out of tune compared to those pure simple ratios.
So the fifths aren't perfectly 3.2 and the thirds aren't perfectly 5.4.
Nope. They're close, but not exact. The fifths are just a tiny bit flat, and the major thirds are noticeably sharper than pure ones, though not as sharp as Pythagorean thirds.
So it's like everything is equally slightly imperfect. That's a great way to put it. It spreads the out-of-tuneness evenly across the board. And our ears have just gotten used to it. It's the sound we expect now.
And without it, so much music just wouldn't work.
Absolutely. Think about Wagner or Debussy or jazz harmony. The harmonic freedom they rely on is totally dependent on equal temperament. J.S. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier was a huge milestone here.
Ah, the well-tempered clavier. Was that actually equal temperament?
Probably not exactly modern equal temperament, but one of the various well-temperaments circulating then. These were systems designed to make all keys usable, even if they weren't perfectly equal. Bach was showing off what was possible.
Got it. So it paved the way. But you still hear criticisms, right? That it sounds bland or something.
You do. Some people argue that by smoothing everything out, we lose the distinct character or color that different keys had in older temperaments, like mean tone.
Where C major might have felt different from, say, E flat major in a more fundamental way.
Exactly. They feel equal temperament homogenizes the sound. But its practicality is undeniable. The whole musical world is pretty much built on it now.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. It's not just about how we divide the octave, but where we start, right? The actual pitch. This brings us to A440.
Yes, the standard pitch.
Yeah.
We need a reference point, an anchor frequency. And for a long time now, that's been A above middle C, set at 440 hertz, or cycles per second, A440.
And this wasn't always 440 hertz.
Oh, far from it. Go back a few centuries, and the pitch for A was all over the map, depending on the place, the time, the type of music.
Huh.
It could vary by a semitone, even more sometimes.
Wow, that must have been chaotic for musicians.
Imagine trying to get an orchestra together with instruments built to different pitch standards, or singers trying to match instruments. It was a real problem.
So how did we land on 440?
It was a long process of conferences and agreements, really solidifying in the 20th century. The need for consistency became urgent with radio broadcasting and recordings.
Ah, you need a reliable standard if you're going to record something in London and play it back accurately in New York.
Precisely. So A440 was gradually adopted and then formally recognized internationally, like by the ISO, in 1955.
And the impact, it just made everything easier.
Pretty much international collaboration, instrument manufacturing, consistent recordings.
Yeah.
A440 facilitated all of that.
Not everyone uses it, even now.
That's right. It's the dominant standard, but not universal.
Yep.
Many historical performance groups, for instance, will tune lower.
Like for Baroque music, I've heard of A4 1400 hertz.
Exactly. That's roughly a semitone lower than 440, and it's thought to be closer to the pitch used in box time, for example. It gives the music a different quality.
How so? What difference does the pitch make?
Well, lower pitches like 415 can sound maybe warmer, darker, more mellow to some people. Higher pitches like 440 might feel brighter, more brilliant, maybe more energetic. It can subtly affect the whole mood.
Interesting. And some people advocate for other pitches too, right? Not just historical ones.
Yeah, there's definitely a growing interest in exploring alternatives, both to standard pitch and to equal temperament itself. People want different sounds, different expressive possibilities.
Like that A4 44 hertz idea.
Right. You hear claims about 444 hertz being somehow more natural or having positive effects on the body or mind.
Is there science behind that?
Honestly, the strong scientific evidence is pretty thin. But some people just prefer the sound, maybe find it feels a bit more relaxed or grounded than A440. It's subjective.
And beyond just the reference pitch, people are experimenting with entirely different ways of dividing the octave again.
Absolutely. Things like just intonation are getting renewed attention.
Just intonation. That's going back to those pure, simple ratios.
Exactly. Prioritizing perfect mathematical harmony, like 5.4 for the major third, 3.2 for the fifth, the chords can sound incredibly resonant and pure.
But the catch is.
The catch is, it really only works well in one key and maybe its closest relatives. Modulating is very difficult because intervals that are pure in one key become dissonant in another. Not practical for complex music.
Okay, what else?
Then you've got the whole world of microtonal music.
Microtonal, meaning more than 12 notes per octave.
Way more, sometimes. Dividing the octave into, say, 19, 31, 53, or even more tiny steps. Composers like Harry Partch, Wendy Carlos, they built unique instruments and created sounds you just can't get otherwise.
Wow, that opens up a whole new universe of pitches.
It really does. And then, as we mentioned, there's the revival of historical temperaments like mean tone or various well temperaments.
To hear older music as it might have originally sounded?
Yes, partly for historical accuracy, but also just to experience those different sonic flavors, the unique colors and nuances that equal temperament smoothed over.
So all these alternatives are about moving away from the compromises of equal temperament to find something else. Purity or novelty or historical connection.
I think that sums it up well. They offer different palettes, different textures, different emotional qualities, a wider spectrum of sound.
It really is amazing how these tiny, seemingly technical adjustments in tuning have had such a massive impact on, well, everything we hear in music.
It underpins the whole structure, the whole feeling. It's not just math. It reflects what people valued in sound at different times.
So maybe a question for you listening, now that you've sort of peered behind the curtain of tuning, how might that change how you hear music?
Yeah. Will you start noticing those subtle differences? Maybe question why things sound the way they do.
It might be interesting to actively seek out some recordings using different temperaments or pitch standards.
Definitely. Listen to some Baroque music at A415, or find some mean tone recordings, or even dip your toes into microtonal stuff if you're feeling adventurous. Hear the difference.
You could explore the different flavors of historical temperaments or check out composers who really push the boundaries.
It's just a reminder that tuning isn't some fixed, boring, technical detail. It's right at the heart of musical expression, and it's still evolving. A constant exploration of sound